My son came through my kitchen door so fast he nearly knocked one of my dining chairs sideways. The legs scraped across the tile with a harsh sound that made me flinch before I even looked up. Malcolm's face was glowing in a way I had not seen in years. Wild, fever bright. The kind of look people get when something unbelievable has just stepped into their life. His hand shook as he held out his phone toward me like it carried the voice of God himself. "Mama," he said, breathing hard, half laughing, half crying. I think I just hit the lottery." For a moment the room went quiet except for the refrigerator humming behind me. I wiped my hand slowly on the dish towel and stepped closer. The screen showed a message from the state lottery site confirming the ticket numbers had matched the jackpot drawing. And the amount written there looked almost unreal. $20 million. Malcolm ran one hand through his hair, pacing the small stretch of floor between the stove and the sink, like he could not stand still long enough to process what he was seeing. "I checked the numbers 3 times, he said quickly. "Then I checked the website. It's real, Mama. They say verification takes about a week, but..." The back door burst open before he could finish. Tamara rushed in like she had already heard the news through the walls. "Did you check it again?" she demanded, grabbing the phone straight out of Malcolm's hand before he could answer. Her eyes raced across the screen. Then she screamed. It was a sharp, high sound that bounced off the cabinets and filled the kitchen, like fireworks going off in a small room. She threw both arms around Malcolm's neck, and the two of them started spinning right there between my stove and my sink, laughing, crying, praising God, talking so fast their sentences ran together. "We're free," Malcolm kept saying. "Do you hear me? We're free now." Tamara was already talking about houses, bigger ones, better neighborhoods. She said they would never have to work another miserable job again. She said they could leave this entire life behind. I stood there holding my dish towel and watched my own kitchen fill up with their excitement, like I was not even standing in it. My name is Rochelle Foster, and I have lived long enough to know something people do not like to hear. Money does not change people nearly as quickly as they claim. Most times, it simply removes the mask they were already tired of wearing. For 7 years, I had helped carry my son and his wife through seasons they could not survive on their own. When Malcolm lost his job the first time, I paid their late rent so they would not be evicted. When they rushed into buying a house they were not financially ready for, I quietly covered several mortgage payments to keep them from falling behind. When their car broke down, I helped with the replacement, insurance bills, doctor visits, groceries during slow months. There were even times I reached into my savings to help Tamara's family when they had their own crisis. I told myself that was what family did. You held each other up until the hard seasons passed. I stretched my checks, skipped things I wanted, promised myself it would not be forever. But standing there that morning, listening to them plan their brand new future out loud, I noticed something so small and so ugly, it settled into my stomach like a stone. Not once had either of them turned toward me and said, "Mama, look what this means for all of us." I was standing 3 feet away, and already I had disappeared. Malcolm was pacing now, talking about calling his boss and finally quitting. Tamara pressed both hands against her cheeks, smiling so wide the corners of her eyes looked sharp. She said people were finally going to see who they really were, and the way she said it made me look up, because it was not joy I heard in her voice. It was hunger. Deep, old, impatient hunger. Around the middle of all that noise, I set my towel down and leaned one hand against the counter just to steady myself. If you're listening to me right now, tell me where you're watching from. Because pain travels farther than we expect, and sometimes the only thing that makes it lighter is knowing somebody somewhere understands what it sounds like when love begins to turn strange inside your own home. Tamara finally looked at me then, but not the way a daughter would look at a woman who had helped keep her lights on. Her eyes passed over my face slowly, measuring me, and a smile touched her mouth, that did not reach anywhere warm. It was neat, controlled, almost careful. "Well," she said softly, smoothing the front of her shirt as if she were already stepping into another life. "Lottery verification usually takes about a week." Malcolm turned toward her immediately. She slipped her hand into his and squeezed it. And the two of them shared a look so private and so complete, I suddenly felt like I had walked into a conversation I was never meant to hear. Then Tamara glanced at me again and spoke almost under her breath, but not so quietly that I could miss it. 7 days, Malcolm smiled back at her. Tamara's voice dropped even lower. 7 days, she repeated, and our real life finally begins. Sudden money does something ugly to people when greed has already been living inside them, rent-free. It does not create the rot. It simply turns the light on and lets you see how long it has been there. The morning after Malcolm came bursting into my kitchen with that fever shining in his eyes, the house felt different, in a way I could not explain at first. Nothing had moved. My curtains still let in that same pale morning sun. And the coffee still smelled the way it always did, but the air itself had shifted. It felt thinner somehow, sharper, like the walls had leaned back quietly just to watch what would happen next. I moved through my routine slowly and let them talk. That was one lesson life had taught me early. People tell on themselves fastest when they believe nobody is studying them. For 7 years, I had made that household possible in ways Malcolm had grown so used to that he no longer seemed to see them at all. When he lost his first job 2 years into his marriage and called me in a panic because the rent notice had already been taped to their door, I paid it and told him to take a breath and get back on his feet. When he and Tamara rushed into buying a house that stretched their budget tighter than it should have been, as I quietly covered several mortgage payments during the months they fell behind. When their old sedan died on the side of the expressway and Malcolm called sounding more embarrassed than grateful, I met him at the dealership the next morning and made sure he drove home in something dependable: insurance premiums, grocery money during slow weeks, doctor bills when Tamara caught pneumonia one winter and the hospital invoice came in thick and ugly. I even helped when Tamara's own mother got sick and those medical bills started circling their family like vultures, because I knew what it felt like to stand in trouble with nobody reaching back for you. Back then, they used to call me their blessing, their angel, their safety net. Tamara would wrap both arms around me in the kitchen and say, "Mama Rochelle, I don't know what we would do without you." Malcolm used to kiss the top of my head and promise that one day he would repay every single sacrifice. I believed him. I believed him because I had raised him from nothing but a hard beginning and my own 2 hands. I had Malcolm young, too young. If you ask the people who quietly disappeared from my life when things became difficult, his father left before Malcolm could even recognize the sound of his voice. And by the time I was old enough to see clearly what kind of man he was, I had already burned through every soft excuse a woman can make for a coward. So I worked. I worked when I was tired, when I was sick, when my feet hurt, and when my heart hurt, when the world made it plain that nobody was coming to save me. Everything I built came from understanding what hunger really looks like when it puts on church clothes and calls itself pride. That is why Tamara's changes did not arrive all at once. They came in quiet pieces, a tone here, a pause there, questions that sounded harmless unless you held them up to the light. A few months before Malcolm claimed that winning lottery ticket, she had started asking things over dinner that sat oddly in my ears. Not direct enough to sound rude, Tamara was never careless like that. She preferred to wrap cruelty in politeness. She would stir sugar into her tea and ask casually whether I still kept money invested in the market. She would stand at the refrigerator and mention how much property values had risen in our neighborhood. One afternoon, she stood at the kitchen window looking out across the yard and said, almost admiringly, "This house must be worth a lot now." I remember drying a plate and saying nothing at all. Another evening, when she thought I had already gone upstairs for the night, her voice drifted from the den below, low, neat, careful. "Do you know whose name the house is actually in?" she asked Malcolm. There was a pause. Then my son, my own flesh and blood, answered with a careless shrug I could hear in his voice. "I don't know," he said. "Probably mine one day anyway." I stood halfway down the staircase in the dark with one hand resting on the banister and felt something inside me go very still. Not broken. Not yet. Just still. Because by then I understood exactly what I was hearing. It was not curiosity. It was inventory. And now, after all those years of me carrying them farther than they could walk on their own, Malcolm believed he was 7 days away from $20 million. Lottery verification takes time. At least that was the phrase Malcolm kept using, like if he said it enough, the waiting would feel official instead of dangerous. He said it over breakfast while barely touching his eggs. He said it while pacing the living room with his phone in his hand. He said it into the mirror one morning while adjusting the collar of a shirt. He suddenly seemed to think, looked too ordinary for the kind of man he believed he was about to become. "It's normal, Mama," he told me that second day, almost impatient, as if I had asked when I had not asked him anything at all. Big amounts take time. I nodded and kept wiping down my kitchen counters, but inside I was listening harder than ever, because waiting does not just stretch time, or it stretches character. By the third day, the two of them were no longer talking, like people hoping for a better future. They were talking like people who had already left the one they were standing in. Tamara sat at my dining table with her laptop open, moving through pictures of places neither of them had ever been able to afford before. White balconies over blue water, apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows, kitchens so polished they did not look cooked in. Malcolm leaned over her shoulder, grinning, pointing at things, talking about views and privacy and neighborhoods where people mind their business. He started saying words like portfolio and options in a tone that told me he had only just met them and already thought they belonged to him. By that evening, they were discussing Europe like it was across the street, Paris for a month, Italy in the spring, Greece, before it gets too crowded. Tamara said she wanted linen outfits and one of those long airport walks where people looked at you and knew you had money. Malcolm laughed and said he was done answering to anybody, done waking up early, done struggling, done living like this. That phrase sat with me, like this, because like this was the life I had held together with my own hands while he learned how to stand upright in the world. And the strangest thing was not their dreaming. People dream all the time. It was the shape of the dream. In every version of the future they built out loud, I was missing from it completely. Not hidden in the background, not quietly assumed. Missing. They spoke about moving fast once the money cleared, downsizing obligations, starting fresh. I'm cutting ties with anything that felt heavy. Tamara used that last phrase more than once. Anything that feels heavy. The first time she said it, she was scrolling through furniture online. The second time, she was looking straight at Malcolm over the rim of her glass. He did not answer with words. He just gave one small nod, and that nod bothered me more than if he had shouted. Because people tell the truth with their mouths. Yes, but they tell deeper truth with what they are willing to agree to in silence. I started noticing other little things too. Tamara stopped asking whether I wanted tea when she made a cup for herself. Malcolm took a call in the hallway and lowered his voice when I passed. They both laughed more, but never with me, only around me, like I was some old chair still in the house while they waited for moving day. When that fourth night I came into the den, and the conversation died so fast the room itself seemed embarrassed. Tamara smiled too quickly. Malcolm reached for the television remote, though the screen was already on. "We were just talking numbers," he said, and something about the way he said it turned my stomach. Later, after they went upstairs, I sat alone in the dark for a while with only the lamp by my chair on and the hum of the refrigerator carrying through the house. I tried, for one weak little moment, to tell myself I was reading too much into things. Then I remembered that cold look Tamara had given me in the kitchen. I remembered the question about whose name was on the house. I remembered the way Malcolm had said, "finally free," like freedom had always required distance from me. Close to midnight, or when the house had settled into that creaking silence old homes get after dark, I heard the soft murmur of voices downstairs. Not the television, not a phone. Voices, low, intentional, coming from the kitchen. I stayed still for half a breath, then rose from my chair and moved toward the hallway, every nerve in my body suddenly awake. Late that night, I heard them whispering in the kitchen. I stopped halfway down the hallway when I heard Tamara say the word boundaries in a voice so soft and careful it made the skin along my arms tighten. She was in the kitchen with Malcolm, and the house was doing what old houses do after midnight, carrying every quiet word farther than people expect. I had come out because sleep would not stay with me. Something in my chest had been restless all evening, not quite fear, not yet. More like the kind of uneasy feeling that shows up when your heart already understands something your mind is still trying to protect you from. So I stood there in the dim hallway light and listened. The refrigerator hummed steadily. A cabinet door clicked. Then Tamara said it again, slower this time, as if she were smoothing a wrinkle out of a tablecloth. Once the money clears, we need boundaries. Malcolm gave a short laugh, but it was not a laugh of surprise. Boundaries with who? He asked. That was the first thing that struck me. He did not sound confused. He sounded cautious, like a man stepping into a conversation he already suspected was waiting for him. Tamara did not answer immediately. I could picture her even without seeing her. One hip resting against my counter, arms folded loosely, or that patient little expression she wore whenever she wanted something selfish to sound reasonable. "Come on," she said finally, her voice quiet as prayer and twice as dangerous. "You know what I mean." A pause followed. I heard Malcolm shift his weight. Then Tamara spoke again, calm, controlled. "Your mom can't live with us forever." The sentence was not loud. It did not need to be. It landed with a kind of clean coldness that made my fingers tighten against the hallway table beside me. For a moment, my body forgot where it was. I just stood there in the dark with my palm pressed against polished wood, staring at nothing and waiting, not for her to take it back. Tamara had said exactly what she meant. I was waiting for my son, waiting for Malcolm to remember the woman who sat beside him in emergency rooms, and the woman who stretched groceries across 2 weeks when money ran thin, the woman who quietly paid his light bill more than once before he even had the courage to ask, waiting for him to say one simple sentence. "Don't talk about my mother like that." Just one. Instead, there was the small clink of glass. Malcolm must have picked up a drink. He had always done that when he needed time to think. Tamara continued before he could answer. And what chilled me was not the cruelty. It was the preparation. She had already rehearsed this. "I'm not saying we abandon anybody," she said, her voice wrapped neatly in politeness. The lie sounded almost elegant. "I'm saying things are changing. We need privacy. We need space. We need to stop living like every decision has to include extra weight." Extra weight. That was me now. Well, not the woman who carried them through 7 years of bad choices, emergencies, thin months, and bills they could not manage. Just extra weight. Malcolm exhaled slowly. "You know she helped us," he said. For one foolish second, hope flared inside me so quickly it almost embarrassed me, but Tamara was ready for that too. "And we're grateful," she replied instantly. "But help isn't ownership. Gratitude doesn't mean we stay stuck forever." Her voice dropped lower. "You won $20 million, Malcolm. This is our chance to finally live for ourselves. Our chance, our life, our future. I noticed then how every sentence she spoke had room for him inside it, and none for me. That was the trick. She was not simply drawing a line. She was teaching him how to step across it without feeling like a bad son. And another silence filled the kitchen. Longer this time. I felt it like pressure in my ears. If he defended me now, something might still survive this moment. But if he did not, then whatever was breaking in that kitchen had been breaking long before tonight. I heard a chair scrape lightly across the floor. Then Malcolm spoke, slowly, like a man trying on words before deciding they fit. "Yeah," he said. A quiet second passed. Then he added, "I guess things will be different now." 2 nights later, they stopped lowering their voices. That was how I knew something final had shifted. Cruelty whispers when it is still ashamed of itself. It speaks plainly when it has decided it no longer needs permission. I was in my room folding a sweater I had no real reason to fold when I heard Tamara laugh from down the hall, low and relaxed. And the sound of it made me still my hands. Not because laughter is dangerous on its own, but because hers had changed over those last few days. It had lost warmth. It sounded sharper now, like she was enjoying a private joke the rest of us had not yet been let in on. I set the sweater down on the bed and listened. The house was quiet except for them. No television, no running water, no traffic outside but the occasional passing car. Just their voices drifting cleanly through the hallway as if the walls themselves had given up trying to protect me. Malcolm said something I could not catch. Tamara answered him in a tone so casual it almost made what came next harder to bear. "I'm serious," she said. "You need to stop feeling guilty." I moved closer to my bedroom door without opening it. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, but there was a different feeling underneath that too, something steadier and colder. By then, I was no longer listening, like a frightened woman hoping she had misunderstood. I was listening like somebody collecting truth. Malcolm spoke again, softer. "It's still my mother," he said. "Not, she's been good to us. Not, this is wrong." Just those 5 weak words, as if even in her defense he was already halfway out of the room with her. Tamara let out a small sigh, the kind women use when they are pretending patience with something they have already decided to crush. "And," she asked, "that doesn't mean she stays attached to us forever." I heard the clink of ice in a glass. Malcolm must have poured himself something. Tamara continued, her voice smoother now, almost amused. "You won $20 million. Do you understand what that means? It means we finally get to stop dragging old problems into a new life." Old problems. I closed my eyes for a second. I had been a paycheck when they needed one, a shoulder when they wanted comfort, a resource when the month ran long. But now, with money close enough for them to taste, I had become an old problem. Malcolm did not answer right away, and in that pause I recognized the ugliest thing of all. He was not arguing with her because he did not agree. He was quiet because he was getting used to how agreement sounded in his own mouth. Tamara must have sensed it too, because when she spoke again, there was no softness left. "Your mother needs to find somewhere else to die," she said. When the sentence cut through the house so cleanly that for one moment even the air seemed to stop moving. Then came a short pause and I heard her laugh. Not a loud laugh. Not wild. Worse than that. A light, careless laugh, like she had said something practical and slightly inconvenient. She's useless now. I do not know how long I stood there with my hand flat against the bedroom door. My first feeling was not tears. It was disbelief so sharp it almost felt like embarrassment, because no matter how many red flags life waves in front of a mother, there is always a final part of her that believes love will stop the blade before it goes all the way in. I waited for Malcolm then. I waited the way a body waits for pain after a fall, bracing for it even while hoping maybe it would not come. And I thought surely this would be the place where his voice changed. Surely this would be where he said her name with warning in it. Surely this would be where being my son outweighed being Tamara's husband. Instead, the silence stretched, and in that silence I heard the death of every excuse I had made for him. When Malcolm finally spoke, his tone was quiet, almost tired, as if he were surrendering to an inconvenience instead of betraying the woman who had built his life. "Yeah," he said. Then, after the smallest pause, "We need our own life." 3 days before that so-called lottery verification was supposed to finish, Malcolm knocked on my bedroom door with the slow, careful rhythm people use when they are about to do something ugly and want credit for doing it gently. I was sitting on the edge of my bed with my glasses low on my nose. I'm pretending to read a church bulletin I'd already looked through twice. The moment I heard that knock, something inside me went cold and orderly. Not surprised, not confused, orderly. Because by then there was no part of me still waiting for kindness to interrupt what I already knew was coming. "Come in," I said, and when the door opened, there they were, exactly as I might have pictured them if grief had a sense of humor. Malcolm stood in front, shoulders stiff, eyes already avoiding mine. Tamara was half a step behind him with her arms folded tight across her chest, wearing that same composed expression she carried whenever she wanted cruelty to pass for common sense. Nobody sat down. Nobody smiled. Malcolm cleared his throat once. "Mom," he said, and the words sounded thin in his mouth. "It might be better if you find another place to stay for a while." For a second, the room went so quiet I could hear the ceiling fan clicking above us. I looked at him properly then. Not the man standing in my doorway, the boy underneath him. The child whose fevers I had sat through. The child I had carried on one hip while balancing grocery bags on the other arm. The child who used to run to the door when I came home tired and call me like I was the safest thing in the world. I looked for even a trace of that child in his face and found only a grown man afraid to stand inside his own choices. "For a while," I repeated, because sometimes making a person hear his own lie out loud is the only dignity you can give yourself. Malcolm swallowed. "Just until things settle," he said. "Settle how?" I asked. He opened his mouth, but Tamara stepped in before he could answer, the way she always did when his conscience slowed down the plan. "This house will be different once the money comes," she said. Her tone was smooth, almost businesslike, and that made it worse. Not angry, not embarrassed, just efficient. "Different," I said, still looking at Malcolm. "In what way?" He rubbed one hand over his jaw and glanced at the hallway. "We're trying to think ahead," he muttered. "There'll be changes. We'll need space, privacy." "Privacy," I said again. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in the room. Tamara took one step farther inside, surveying my bedroom as if it had already become temporary. "We're not saying this to hurt you," she said, and that sentence always comes right before harm. "We're saying it because our lives are moving in a new direction." Our lives, not Malcolm's life, not the family, their lives. That little division sat between us plain as a knife on a table. I set the bulletin aside and stood up slowly. My knees were steady. My voice was too. "So, after 7 years of me keeping this roof over all our heads when things went bad," I said, "this is how you've decided to handle your new beginning?" Malcolm finally looked at me then, but only for a second. "Mama, don't make this harder," he said, and something in me hardened at that. Harder, as though hardship had just started for him, and not for the woman he was asking to leave her own room like an unwanted guest. Tamara exhaled through her nose, impatient now that the scene was not ending quickly enough for her liking. "Malcolm," she said without taking her eyes off me, We already talked about this." Then she turned fully to me and added, "You'll be more comfortable somewhere smaller anyway." The insult in that sentence was not loud, but it was complete. Smaller. Somewhere else. Somewhere less visible. Somewhere a woman goes when the usefulness has been squeezed out of her. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I understood. There are moments in life when the soul stops arguing and starts recording. Malcolm shifted aside and reached for the old suitcase near my closet. The same brown case I had used years earlier for church conventions, and one funeral I still do not like remembering. He did not ask permission, he just took it down and set it on the bed. I and Tamara opened my dresser drawer like she had every right to decide what parts of my life deserved folding. I did not stop them. I watched. I watched Malcolm place my nightgowns inside without lifting his eyes. I watched Tamara gather my things with brisk little movements that said she had imagined this longer than today. And when they were done, they carried my suitcase through the hallway, past the framed family pictures, past the dining table I had paid for, past the front door of the house I had sustained, and they placed it outside. I stood on the front walk with my suitcase resting beside my leg and looked at the house I had paid for as if I were seeing it for the first time. The porch light was on. But the same warm yellow bulb I had climbed up and replaced myself 2 months earlier now spilled across the steps and the small flower pots by the railing, making the whole place look soft and peaceful from the street. That was the part that turned my stomach. Betrayal rarely arrives looking monstrous. Most times it stands right there in familiar light, wearing the face of home. Behind me, the front door closed. Not loudly, not with the kind of slam that belongs to shouting arguments, just a firm, careful click. Final enough to say everything Malcolm and Tamara wanted this moment to mean. I did not turn around. Across the street, a curtain shifted in one neighbor's front window. 2 houses down a porch chair creaked slowly as someone leaned forward. Nobody came outside. Nobody called my name. And people know when a family moment has gone wrong. Most decent folks do the same thing when they sense shame hanging in the air. They look just long enough to understand what happened, then they pretend not to see the rest. I did not blame them. In truth, I was grateful. Some wounds are easier to carry when nobody tries to comfort you through them. I did not knock on the door again. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind Malcolm who paid the mortgage that kept a roof over his head. I did not ask Tamara to remember the groceries, the car payments, the hospital bills, the years when their life would have collapsed without my hands quietly holding the edges together. Gratitude forced out of a cold heart is just another kind of humiliation. Instead, I picked up my suitcase. The handle felt heavier than it should have, and I walked down the steps slowly, feeling every board beneath my feet, every breath in my chest, every ounce of disbelief settling into something harder and steadier. By the time I reached the sidewalk, I understood something that calmed me more than anger ever could. They believed they had already won. That was what made them careless. They believed proximity to money had already changed ownership, changed power, changed memory itself, our house, our future, our new life. They had repeated those words so often over the past few days they had started believing them. I kept walking until I reached my car parked at the curb. I placed the suitcase in the back seat and closed the door carefully. The night air smelled faintly of damp grass. Somebody's dryer sheets drifted from a nearby vent. Ordinary smells, ordinary street, to ordinary neighborhood. And standing there in the middle of all that ordinary, my only child had just helped his wife remove me from a home I had carried on my back through 7 years of their instability. I rested one hand on the roof of my car and stood there for a moment. That was when the grief finally arrived. Not as tears, not yet. It came as a deep physical weariness, the kind that begins in the bones. Because when you finally stop making excuses for someone you love, the truth gets heavier before it gets freeing, But even inside that heaviness, something else had begun to rise. Quiet, precise, steadier than pain. They had thrown me out of a house that belonged entirely to me. Not partially, not sentimentally, legally, completely mine. I had made sure of that years earlier when Malcolm and Tamara first moved in and their finances began wobbling. Back then, I believed planning ahead was simply wisdom. I had no idea it would someday become self-defense. Malcolm never knew the details because he had never asked. Tamara never knew because people who live by opportunity often assume generosity means weakness. They assume the person giving is the easiest one to take from. They were wrong. The house security system had been upgraded the year before after a string of break-ins a few streets over. Cameras covered the front entry, the downstairs hallway, the den, the kitchen, clear video, clear audio, every conversation that grew too sharp, every whisper that carried too far, every moment from the past week had been captured. The smiles, the planning, the coldness, even the suitcase. I knew exactly what those recordings held. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door behind me. For a moment, I simply sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The decision about whether what had happened was real had already been made. What remained now was deciding what would happen next. I opened my handbag, took out my phone, and stared at one number for a long moment before pressing it. That night, I made a phone call. 3 days after Malcolm and Tamara put me out of my own house, the call I had arranged finally reached my son. I know the exact day because I had been counting not by hours anymore, but by behavior. That is what betrayal does once it finishes breaking your heart. It teaches you to study people with the same seriousness you once used to love them. And by then I was staying in a quiet guest suite connected to an old professional relationship I had kept private for years. And I had spent those 3 days doing nothing dramatic at all. No crying on anybody's shoulder. No frantic calls to relatives who had not earned the right to hear my pain. No begging. I met with the people I needed to meet. I reviewed what I already knew. I confirmed what the cameras had captured. I listened once, only once, to Tamara's voice saying I was useless now, and after that, I did not need to hear it again. Some sentences do their damage the first time and then simply sit inside you, waiting to become fuel. The call was scheduled for late morning. Not too early because I wanted them awake and fully swollen with confidence. Not too late because arrogance is sharpest before the day has had time to humble anybody. When I remember sitting very still with a cup of tea cooling beside me while the banker handled it from his office. His voice, when he practiced the wording with me the evening before, had been exactly what I wanted. Neutral, polished, impossible to read. Nothing in it hinted at scandal or accusation. Nothing that would make Malcolm suspicious enough to hesitate. That mattered. I did not want fear pulling them into that meeting. I wanted greed to do it. When the time came, I pictured Malcolm looking down at his phone, probably with that same quick greed tightening his face. He had always answered professional calls differently from personal ones. Straighter posture, deeper voice. He liked the sound of importance, even when it had not been earned. I learned later that Tamara was right beside him when the screen lit up, and I believed that easily. By then, she had turned herself into his shadow whenever money was involved. The banker introduced himself exactly as planned. "This is Whitmore Private Banking." A pause. Enough to let the name settle. Enough to make prestige do half the work on its own. Then he continued in that even tone of his. "We need you to visit our office regarding financial matters connected to the funds you believe are currently being verified." That sentence was carefully built. Professional, dry, respectable. Just vague enough to let their own fantasies fill in the rest. Malcolm, I was told, asked one question immediately. "So this is about the 20 million. He tried to sound calm, but desperation has a way of shining through men who think money is about to change what they are. The banker did not confirm much. He did not need to. When he simply repeated that Malcolm's in-person presence was requested and that the matter should be handled promptly. That was all. But greed translates brevity into promise faster than any language on earth. I did not have to be in the room to know what happened next. I knew Tamara would have looked at Malcolm with her whole face lighting up. I knew Malcolm's voice would have changed, grown louder, faster, younger somehow, like a boy who thinks a locked door is finally opening. I knew they would hear private banking and imagine polished accounts, discreet handshakes, and access to a world they had started dressing themselves for the moment they believed that lottery story. What satisfied me most was not the fact that they were excited. It was how easily they told on themselves one last time. No concern, no hesitation, and no shadow of what they had done to me 3 days earlier. They had not spent that time reflecting on their cruelty. They had spent it waiting for money to reward it. Later, I was told Tamara actually laughed and clapped her hands together before hurrying off to change clothes. I believe that too. She was not the kind of woman who prepared for truth. She prepared for entrances. And Malcolm, my son, the boy I once fed from my own plate so he could have enough, grabbed his keys with the confidence of a man who thought the world had finally recognized his value. By the time that call ended, they were no longer discussing whether they should go. They were already moving. They rushed to the office immediately. The office was far more formal than they expected. And that was the first crack in whatever confidence Malcolm and Tamara had wrapped around themselves before leaving the house. I know that because I chose the place carefully. I did not want bright glass and trendy furniture and smiling young assistants offering bottled water like they were welcoming new money into a club. I wanted gravity. I wanted silence that pressed on the skin. I wanted the kind of room that makes foolish people suddenly aware of how little they understand. Whitmore Private Banking occupied the upper floors of an older building downtown, one of those places where the lobby still smelled faintly of polish and old paper, where the elevator doors closed with dignity instead of speed, and where nobody raised their voice because power in places like that had no need to. By the time Malcolm and Tamara arrived, I was already upstairs in the conference room beyond the reception area, seated exactly where I intended to be. I was not pacing. I was not trembling. I had chosen a dark dress, simple jewelry, and the posture of a woman who no longer needed to explain herself to anybody in that bloodline. The estate attorney sat to my right with a closed folder in front of him. The private banker sat farther down the table with 2 neat stacks of documents. 2 legal assistants waited in silence. No one asked me if I was sure. By then I was long past the stage of needing reassurance. The receptionist had been told only what she needed to know. She would greet them warmly, use Malcolm's name, and lead them into the smaller waiting area just outside the conference room before bringing them in. Formal enough to flatter them. No controlled enough to unsettle them. Later, piece by piece, I learned how they came through that building. Malcolm trying to wear seriousness like a tailored jacket. Tamara overdressed for discretion, which did not surprise me. Women like her always mistake elegance for victory when they think money is close. The receptionist greeted them politely and asked them to follow her. There were no congratulations, no smiling lottery officials, no balloons, no celebratory language, none of the foolish little signs they must have expected after building a fantasy around that fake windfall. Just polished floors, muted artwork, and people with expensive self-control. I was told that Tamara glanced around almost immediately, taking stock of everything the way she always did when she entered a space she hoped to belong to. And the receptionist led them past the main desk, down a quiet corridor, and into a large conference room with dark wood trim and a long table set beneath soft overhead lighting. Not lavish. Worse than lavish, serious. That room had the kind of order that does not entertain delusion for long. Several lawyers were already there when they entered. Not a crowd, not enough to feel theatrical, but enough to make the temperature in the room change. The private banker sat reviewing a file without any hurry in his movements. One legal assistant adjusted a pen, another checked a document tab and then looked up. Nobody rose with excitement when Malcolm stepped in. Nobody treated him like a winner. That, more than anything, must have been the first true shock. Because people who believe they are walking toward reward always expect warmth. Malcolm, as I was told, hesitated just inside the room and asked, "Are we in the right place?" It was such a small sentence, but I could hear the uncertainty in it even secondhand. Tamara tried to recover faster. "This is about the funds, right?" she asked the receptionist, her voice bright but too tight at the edges. The receptionist, trained better than that, simply said someone would be with them shortly and stepped back out, leaving them alone with all that polished silence and the strange men at the table who did not look impressed by either of them. That was the moment Malcolm's confusion began to deepen. Because greed loves clear signals. It loves easy rooms and smiling faces and words it can quickly translate into ownership. But this room gave him nothing. No welcome, no explanation, just structure, just authority. Just the feeling that maybe he had entered a world where his excitement meant absolutely nothing. I sat on the other side of the closed inner door and imagined the exact second his confidence began to drain. Then the handle turned. The door opened without drama. And when Malcolm looked up, expecting whoever he thought held his future in that building, what he saw instead was me sitting at the head of the table. My son stopped walking so suddenly that Tamara nearly stepped into his back. That was the moment the room took hold of them, not when the receptionist led them down the quiet hallway, not when the glass doors opened into the conference suite, not even when they saw that the room waiting for them looked nothing like the kind of place two greedy people imagine when they believe money is about to bless their foolishness. No. And the real shock came when Malcolm lifted his eyes and saw me seated at the head of that long, polished table. Calm, still, waiting. There were people seated beside me who did not look like family. They did not look like friends, and they certainly did not look confused about why I was there. Malcolm froze in the doorway, as if his body had suddenly forgotten what movement came next. Tamara's hand slipped slowly from his arm. The color drained from her face so quickly it looked as if someone had lowered a shade behind her skin. Neither of them spoke. They just stared. I had wondered privately whether seeing me there would awaken shame first, or fear. It was fear. I saw it immediately. In the way Malcolm's mouth parted without any sound leaving it. In the way Tamara's eyes began moving too quickly around the room. As she took in the senior estate attorney seated at my right, the private banker further down the table, two legal assistants with open files. Then her eyes came back to me again, searching my face as if she might somehow rearrange the entire scene into something less dangerous. But nothing in that room was willing to rearrange itself for them. I did not stand. I did not greet them. I sat exactly where power had placed me and allowed silence to do what silence does best when guilty people walk into it. It makes every heartbeat louder than speech. Malcolm finally found enough breath to say one word. "Mama?" That word might have moved me once. Years earlier, it could have unlocked every door in my heart. But that day, after the whispers, after the cameras, or after the suitcase placed on the front walk like I was an inconvenience to be removed, it landed in the room like something far too late to matter. I did not answer him. Not because I wanted drama, because I wanted clarity. And clarity sometimes requires letting a person hear how small their voice sounds when love is no longer cushioning their choices. Tamara recovered before Malcolm did, only in posture, though. She lifted her chin slightly and smoothed her mouth into that practiced expression of hers, the one she used whenever she believed composure might pass for innocence. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," she said. But even she heard the weakness in it. Her voice carried a tightness I had never heard before. The attorney beside me did not so much as blink, and he placed one hand calmly on the folder in front of him and looked toward the empty chairs across the table. "Please sit," he said. His voice was even, formal, and impossible to argue with. No one in that room raised their voice. No one needed to. Malcolm still had not moved. He was looking at me the way children look at a locked door after they finally understand they do not have the key. "What is this?" he asked. The question embarrassed me for him. What is this? As if confusion could erase behavior, as if not understanding the stage somehow changed the script he had already acted out with his own mouth and hands. Tamara touched his sleeve, not gently, urgently. "Sit down," she whispered through clenched teeth. That told me something else. She was frightened, yes, but she was already calculating, already trying to recover ground. Malcolm and Tamara sat down slowly across from me, side by side, though not nearly as united as they had been in my kitchen days earlier. Up close, I could see the strain in Malcolm's face. He looked tired in the way greed makes people tired when it realizes it has entered a room smarter than itself. Tamara folded her hands tightly in her lap. One of her nails tapped once against her ring finger before she forced it still. The attorney waited until both of them were seated. Then he linked his fingers together lightly on the table. "We need to discuss the last 7 days," he said. No one answered. The words settled over the room with the same cold precision as a lock turning. Malcolm looked at me again, desperate now, hoping I would interrupt, or hoping I would rescue him from the authorities sitting calmly on either side of my silence. I did not move. The private banker glanced down at the documents before him. One of the legal assistants adjusted a page. The attorney reached forward at last, drew the file toward him, opened it with careful hands, and then, without looking away from Malcolm, slid a folder slowly across the table. The attorney opened the folder with the same calm care a surgeon might use before making the first cut, and in that room the sound of paper shifting seemed louder than it had any right to be. Malcolm leaned forward without meaning to. Tamara stayed still beside him, but I could see the tension in her jaw from where I sat. She had gone beyond performance by then. The confidence she had worn into that building had fallen clean off her, and what remained was a woman trying to think her way out of a trap that had already closed. No one spoke at first. The attorney glanced down, turned one page, then another, and finally lifted his eyes to Malcolm with the kind of expression professionals use when they are about to say something irreversible. "There was no lottery," he said. No flourish, no dramatic pause before it. Just the truth, plain and level. The words hit Malcolm like a physical blow. He blinked once, then twice, as though maybe he had heard them wrong. "What?" he said, and it came out thin, smaller than I had ever heard his voice sound. Beside him, Tamara's shoulders went rigid. She did not look at me. She looked at the attorney, then at the private banker, then down at the table, as if some useful explanation might be waiting in the grain of the wood. When the attorney did not repeat himself immediately, he let the silence do its work. That was wise. Some truths need a second to strip the blood from people's faces before anything else is added to them. Malcolm gave a short, breathless laugh that was not laughter at all. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, that doesn't make sense. I saw the message. I saw the confirmation." "You saw what was arranged for you to see," the attorney replied. His tone stayed respectful, but not warm. Respect is easy in rooms like that. Warmth must be earned. Malcolm turned to me then, searching my face for the kind of denial only a mother might still offer a son she once pitied too easily. I gave him nothing. I sat with my hands folded and let him face the room he had walked himself into. That seemed to unsettle him more than the attorney's words, and he looked back at the folder. "So what is this?" he asked. But there was panic under it now. Tamara finally spoke, and though she tried to keep her tone even, I heard the crack in it. "If there was no lottery, then why are we here?" The private banker glanced at the attorney, then back down at his notes. It was the attorney who answered. "Because the $20 million you believed had been won," he said, each word placed carefully, "was actually a planned inheritance." This time, the silence that followed was not confusion. It was impact. Malcolm looked at me as if I had become somebody he had never known at all. His mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes moved across my face, or trying to reconcile the woman who had paid bills and cooked meals and quietly covered their lives with the woman sitting at the head of a polished table, while estate lawyers discussed numbers he had never imagined belonged anywhere near me. That look told me something important. He had depended on me for years, but he had never actually respected the scale of what I had built. Tamara was quicker. Her breathing changed first, shallow, controlled. Then she straightened in her chair and said, "So this is some kind of joke?" I almost admired the nerve of that. A woman can help force her mother-in-law out of her own home and still sit in a boardroom asking whether consequences are a joke. The attorney did not rise to it. "No," he said, "it is not a joke." He turned another page in the folder. Mrs. Foster had, until very recently, or intended to transfer a substantial portion of her estate to her son. Malcolm's eyes stayed fixed on me. "You were going to give me $20 million?" he asked, and the question was so naked, so immediate, that any remaining softness inside me shrank back from it. Not Mama, why? Not how could this be? Not after everything? Just the money sitting there in the middle of his shock like the truest thing about him. I felt something settle all the way inside me then. Not grief this time, certainty. The attorney placed one hand flat over the file and spoke the final sentence in the same measured tone he had used from the beginning. The lottery announcement, he said, was a behavioral test. The attorney lifted a small remote from beside his folder and pressed one button without saying a word. Across the room, the large screen mounted on the wall came to life with a soft mechanical click. For a strange moment, all we could see was the dark reflection of that conference room staring back at us. Polished table, leather chairs, quiet faces waiting for something none of them could stop. Malcolm noticed the screen first. Tamara followed a second later. Her posture was still straight, still carrying that brittle kind of composure people use when they know something unpleasant is approaching but have not yet decided whether they will deny it or survive it. Then the footage began. No dramatic editing, no theatrical cuts, just the truth, clear, steady, patient. The first clip showed my kitchen. Malcolm, with that feverish excitement lighting his face. Tamara wrapped around him, laughing loudly, already talking about houses, cars, the quitting jobs, planning a life with money that had not even been verified yet. The attorney let the clip run just long enough for recognition to settle into their faces. Then he pressed the remote again. A second recording appeared. Tamara sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, her voice calm, measured, talking about privacy, space, and finally being able to live for ourselves. Malcolm beside her, nodding instead of questioning. Another press of the remote. Another clip. The quiet sounds of my house carrying their late-night conversation farther than they had imagined. The word boundaries. My son's weak hesitation. Tamara's answers. Always ready, always polished, always cruel in that particular way that tries to disguise itself as practicality. I did not look at the screen then. I looked at them. That was enough. Malcolm's shoulders folded inward a little more with every recording, as if shame were a kind of weather he had not prepared himself to stand in. Tamara kept her chin lifted, but the lift had changed. It was no longer confidence. It was strain. The strain that comes when someone realizes the performance of innocence has already failed. The attorney pressed the remote again. Another recording appeared, this one taken from the hallway outside my bedroom. The camera angle was clear enough to catch small details. Malcolm refusing to meet my eyes, Tamara standing beside him with her arms folded neatly across her chest, my own figure in the doorway, still, upright, waiting. Then Malcolm's voice came through the speakers. Mom, it might be better if you find another place to stay." Hearing it there inside that quiet room made the sentence sound worse than it had the night it was spoken. Smaller, colder, more deliberate. Then Tamara stepped forward in the recording, exactly as she had in real life. Neat, certain, controlled. "This house will be different once the money comes," she said. One of the legal assistants lowered her eyes toward her notes. The private banker remained perfectly still. The attorney pressed the remote one last time. The final recording appeared. The kitchen. Late at night. Malcolm leaning against the counter, Tamara standing beside him with a glass in her hand. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her voice came through the speakers, clear enough to strip the air in the room bare. Your mother needs to find somewhere else to die." Even now, inside that polished conference room, surrounded by lawyers and documents and measured silence, the sentence landed with the same cold force it had carried the first time I heard it. Then came the laugh, small, careless, and after it the words that erased every excuse Malcolm might once have hidden behind. "She's useless now." Nobody moved. The room went still in that deep, expensive way certain rooms do, where silence does not feel empty. It feels official. Malcolm stared down at the table as if the grain in the wood might open and swallow him. His hands were clasped so tightly, his knuckles had turned pale. Tamara inhaled sharply through her nose, but she still did not look at me. She looked angry now, not ashamed, angry that the truth had survived them, that, more than anything, told me exactly who she had always been. The attorney allowed the silence to settle fully before he pressed the remote one final time. The screen went dark. "The 7-day period," he said calmly, "was established to observe conduct, intent, and character under the belief that significant wealth was imminent." Malcolm spoke at last, though he still did not lift his head. "Mom," he said hoarsely. And then nothing followed. The attorney closed the remote slowly in his palm and looked from Malcolm to Tamara and back again. "What you have seen," he said evenly, "is only the behavioral portion of this review." Then he paused. "There is something worse." The private banker drew a single document from the stack in front of him and placed it on the table with more care than force. But the sound it made still seemed to strike Malcolm harder than any shouting could have. By then the room had already changed shape around them. The shock of the fake lottery was behind us. The humiliation of hearing their own words played back in polished silence was behind us too. What remained now was colder than embarrassment and steadier than anger. Consequence. The banker turned the paper so it faced Malcolm and Tamara, then rested 2 fingers lightly near the bottom as if to anchor it there. "The property title," he said, his tone courteous and exact, "belongs solely to Mrs. Foster." Malcolm lifted his head slowly, like the effort of it cost him something. For 1 second, he just stared at the page without touching it. I watched his eyes move across the document, then stop, then return to the line that mattered most. I had seen that expression before in other people over the years, though not often. It is the face a person makes when reality arrives fully dressed and leaves no room for denial. Tamara leaned in beside him, and even from across the table I could see the moment she found the same line. Her mouth tightened. She did not ask to read it more closely. She understood it the first time. The house was mine. Not emotionally mine. Not loosely mine because I had paid most of the bills. Not the kind of mine family members assume can be argued away once they start feeling entitled. Legally, formally, entirely mine. The attorney let that settle before he spoke. Which means, he said, folding one hand over the other, that removing Mrs. Foster from the property constituted an unlawful eviction. He did not say it loudly. He did not need to. Something about a measured voice makes bad news feel even more serious, as if the room has already accounted for your panic and found it irrelevant. Malcolm looked up from the paper and finally turned to me with a kind of raw disbelief that would have touched me once. "Mama," he said, and I could hear the plea trying to form behind the word. I didn't know. It came out fast, almost childlike. I did not answer him, not because I had nothing to say, but because by then that sentence meant less than he wanted it to. He did not know because he had never cared to know until he believed money had arrived and made knowledge useful. Tamara spoke before the silence could finish exposing him. He thought the house would eventually be his anyway, she said. And there it was again. That strange instinct of hers to step forward and make things worse by trying to make them sound reasonable. The attorney turned his eyes to her, not unkindly, just without softness. "Expectation is not ownership," he said, "and future assumptions do not create present rights." Tamara sat back a fraction, but I could see the anger now moving under her skin. She was not angry at what they had done. She was angry that paperwork existed, angry that structure existed, angry that somewhere along the line I had been more careful than they were greedy. Malcolm swallowed hard. "We weren't trying to," he began, then stopped because even he could hear how empty that sounded. "Weren't trying to what? Throw me out, control the house, build a new life by erasing the woman who had financed the old one?" Or the attorney spared him the humiliation of finishing. "Intent is only one part of what matters here," he said. "Conduct matters as well. The removal was documented. The verbal statements were recorded. The timeline is clear." At that, Malcolm's gaze dropped back to the table. His shoulders seemed smaller than they had when he burst into my kitchen announcing $20 million. Fear had a way of removing size from people. Tamara, though, was still fighting the room in her own mind. "Are you threatening us?" she asked, and there was a little break in the middle of the sentence, small but telling. The attorney's expression did not change. "No," he said. "I am describing the legal exposure created by your actions." The private banker slid the title document back into place and then added, almost gently, "The consequences could be severe." He let that sit, then repeated with the same composed voice, "Very severe." Nobody moved. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter. Across the table, Malcolm looked as though he had finally begun to understand that this meeting was not about money coming in. It was about ground giving way underneath him. I sat there with my hands folded and let the truth take its proper shape in front of him. For years, he had treated my support like weather, something that simply existed around him. Now, for the first time, he was being made to see the architecture beneath it. The banker reached to his right then, drew another file from the stack, and opened it. The banker spoke so gently that for a moment his voice almost sounded merciful. That was the cruel beauty of certain kinds of truth, and they did not need to arrive shouting to leave a mark. He opened the second file in front of him, adjusted one page with calm fingers, and looked directly at Malcolm as though he were speaking to a man who still had the dignity to hear bad news properly. "The inheritance you believed was $20 million, he began, then paused just long enough for the number to settle into the room again. Malcolm's eyes lifted at once. Even after everything, the fake lottery, the recordings, the title, the legal exposure, the money still pulled his attention faster than anything else. That alone would have been enough to break what little was left of me if I had not already done my breaking in private. That amount, the banker continued, represented only a portion of Mrs. Foster's estate. This time, even Tamara turned fully toward him. To all the strain she had tried so hard to contain, sharpened into something closer to hunger. I watched it happen in real time. That was the thing about greed. It could survive humiliation if you fed it one more possibility. Malcolm stared, then looked at me again, and I could see the arithmetic trying to happen behind his eyes. Not grief, not remorse. Calculation. How much more? What else? How wrong had he been about me? The banker did not offer exact totals right away. He did not need to. He referenced holdings, accounts, long-term assets, and private reserves with the calm confidence of a man describing architecture that had been standing quietly for years while other people walked past without understanding its value. I said nothing. I let Malcolm and Tamara sit with it. Let them understand, piece by piece, and that the woman they had treated like a burden had built more than either of them had ever thought to ask about. I had not been funding them out of desperation or draining myself empty to keep them afloat. I had been choosing year after year to keep my son and his household from collapsing. There is a difference between sacrifice and incapacity, and Malcolm had never bothered to learn it. Tamara spoke first. "How much?" she asked. No softness, no shame. Just that question, quick and naked. The attorney did not even look at her. "The exact figures are not the issue before us today," he said. That answer irritated her. I saw it in the set of her mouth. But she stayed quiet because, finally, she understood she was in a room where impatience had no power. The banker turned one more page. "What matters," he said, "is that the inheritance review was contingent upon observed conduct during the 7-day period in which Mr. Foster believed these funds were imminent." Malcolm dropped his gaze again. He already knew where that sentence was going. He just was not ready to hear it spoken in a voice that made it final. "After reviewing the conduct that took place during that period," the banker said, "including verbal statements, documented intent, and the unlawful removal of Mrs. Foster from her property, the proposed inheritance transfer was withdrawn." Withdrawn. Such a clean word for such a complete collapse. Malcolm inhaled sharply. Tamara's fingers tightened around each other in her lap. Neither of them interrupted. The banker continued in the same tone. "The assets originally intended for Mr. All Foster were redirected according to revised estate instructions." Redirected. That word landed differently. Withdrawn could still sound like delay to a desperate mind. Redirected meant gone. Gone somewhere else. Gone on purpose. Malcolm looked up at me as though he still believed a mother's face might soften at the right moment and reverse everything with one sigh. But I had no sigh left for him. Not after the kitchen, not after the hallway, not after my suitcase on the porch like I was some tired old inconvenience he could move aside now that imaginary money had made him feel taller. "Mama," he said, and then stopped. The room waited. His throat moved once before he found the rest of it. "Why would you do this to us?" That question hung there longer than any of the others had. Maybe because it was the first time he had spoken from the center of his own loss instead of the edge of his confusion. But even then, I heard the wrongness in it. Do this to us. As if I had been the one who tested love and failed it. As if I had forced my own son to agree that I should find somewhere else to die. As if consequence were cruelty and betrayal were merely a misunderstanding. I looked at him across that long, polished table and realized the full size of what he had actually lost was still bigger than the money. He had lost the right to ask me that question and expect comfort in the answer. He had lost the version of me that would have rushed to explain myself just so he would not feel abandoned. And for the first time since he was a boy, I saw him without the veil of motherhood over my eyes. Not as my child, as a man, a weak one, a greedy one, a man who had opened his hands only when he thought wealth was falling into them. I let the silence sharpen around him before I prepared to speak. I stood slowly, not because my legs were weak, but because some moments deserve the full weight of a woman rising into them. The chair slid back with a soft sound against the polished floor, and every eye in that room followed me. Malcolm lifted his head. Tamara went still beside him. The attorney said nothing. The banker said nothing. Nobody interrupted because by then the room understood something my son had not yet learned. This was the part no paperwork could deliver for me. This was the part that belonged to my mouth, my memory, and the 7 long days that had stripped every excuse from the people sitting across that table. I looked at Malcolm first, really looked at him. Not through the blur of birthdays, sacrifices, and old forgiveness, not through the soft lie mothers sometimes tell themselves that the good child they remember is still hiding somewhere inside the grown one who keeps disappointing them. I looked at him as he truly was, a man who had grown up without his father and now carried that same man's cowardice plainly on his face. That realization did not stab me the way it might have years ago. It settled. That was the strangest piece of all. Some truths stop hurting once they stop surprising you. Then I turned to Tamara. She stood straighter than Malcolm, but she was not stronger. I could see the effort it took for her to keep her mouth still, to keep anger from spilling out where dignity ought to have been. Even now, even after the recordings, the documents, or the quiet corrections from people she could neither charm nor intimidate, she was still trying to stand inside pride as if it were shelter. But pride is a thin roof when truth begins to leak through it. "I gave you 7 days," I said. My voice sounded different to me in that room, lower, clearer, steadier. 7 days to prove you were my family. Nobody moved. Malcolm's eyes were wet now, but I had reached an age where tears alone no longer impressed me. I had cried too honestly in my life to bow to convenient ones. 7 days, I repeated, and before a single dollar ever touched your hands, before anything in your life had actually changed, you told each other exactly who I was to you. Malcolm opened his mouth as if he wanted to speak. I lifted one hand slightly. That small movement stopped him, and for the first time in that meeting he fell silent because I wanted him to. "No," I said quietly. "You've spoken enough." The silence that followed felt earned. I allowed it to sit between us before continuing. "You did not fail because you wanted money. Money tempts many people. That part is ordinary." I looked from Malcolm to Tamara. "You failed because the moment you believed life was about to become easier, kindness became optional to you. Respect became optional. Gratitude became optional." I paused, and I became optional. Tamara looked down then, only for a second, but it was the first honest movement I had seen from her all day. "You thought I was useful while I was carrying you," I continued. "The minute you believed I had served my purpose, you started talking about me like I was weight, like I was clutter." My eyes returned to Malcolm, like I should find somewhere else to die. Those words landed heavier in that bright conference room than they had in the darkness of my hallway, because now there was nowhere to hide. No whispers, no private cruelty, only truth standing upright under good lighting. Malcolm's face broke then, but I did not step forward. Some grief arrives too late to deserve comfort. "The inheritance was redirected this morning," I said calmly. "Part of it will fund scholarships for young women raising children alone, because I know exactly what it costs to build a life when nobody stands behind you." I folded my hands lightly in front of me. "Part will go to families struggling with medical debt, because I remember what it feels like when one bill can make an entire house start shaking. And the rest will go where it can do good, without ever being mistaken for permission." Tamara closed her eyes briefly at that. Malcolm stared at me like he was hearing a language he should have learned years ago. "You left that house with more than nothing," I said. "You left it with a chance to still be decent before money ever touched you." I shook my head slightly. "That was the real inheritance. And you threw it away yourselves." I reached for my handbag, not dramatically, just with finality. The attorney stood. The banker closed the open file. Across the table, Malcolm looked smaller than I had ever seen him, and I knew that feeling would stay with him longer than any number ever could. I looked at him one last time, and then I said the only truth that mattered. The moment my son believed he had won $20 million, I paused. He lost something far more valuable.